Good afternoon. I am Ann Applebaum, and I am the director of the Transitions Forum at the Legatum Institute. And we are really, really pleased today to be doing this presentation in cooperation with Pomed, whose name I've just said reminds me of a lot of European words for tomato, pomidor, pomidoro, and so on. I'm especially pleased to be presenting it with our colleague, Fadil Azazira, who has written a very brilliant paper on Tunisia and on Tunisians, the relationship between democracy in Tunisia and the reform of the security services. A 15-second word about Legatum. We are a bipartisan public policy institute in London. We are interested in a very general way in prosperity and democracy and how you get to them. My Transitions Forum has a number of different projects, but one of them looks at lessons that we can learn from attempts at reform, political and economic reform in rapidly developing transitional countries. And of course, Tunisia is a country we've been interested for a long time. Because of its important role in the Middle East and because it is one of the few countries that seems to be making some progress. I sat with a colleague in London a few days ago and read Fadil's paper with him, and he's a great expert on Russia and Ukraine, and he read it and he looked at me and said, "Oh, this is so depressing. I thought Tunisia was not like everywhere else, but it is." So I assume the experts in the room won't be as distressed as he was. But anyway, he has a number of positive thoughts as well as a sobering analysis. And thank you very much again for hosting us. Thanks.
All right, thank you, Ann, and thanks everyone for coming. It's my pleasure to introduce this event today and moderate what I hope will be a great discussion. I think in this town there's a lot of discussion, particularly among the sort of democracy and Middle East community, of the optimism surrounding Tunisia's transition, especially for those of us supporting democracy and reform and rights in the region, have grown a bit disenchanted or sort of disappointed at the way a lot of these countries have deteriorated and regressed to authoritarianism that you hear consistently. Well, the one best hope that we still have is Tunisia, and Tunisia's success is important not just for it, but for the region more broadly. I think in many ways, oftentimes that optimism it can be a bit too optimistic in the sense that because things seem to be relatively on track there, the political progress we've seen in Tunisia is far beyond what we've seen in many other countries in the region, that some of the threats to that transition are overlooked or sort of underestimated, and particularly on the economy and the security front. And I think we often hear a sort of glancing mention of the importance of security sector reform and the importance of getting this right to help Tunisia's transition succeed, to help Tunisia as a nation counter the real threats that it does face, but not a real in-depth discussion of what that means. What are those threats? How is the Tunisian security apparatus facing them down? How can the United States and the international community best assist a country really struggling to make its way forward? And so I'm really excited for this discussion today with excellent panelists that will get us started to look deeper into these issues. We'll start here with Fala Ali Reza, who's put together an excellent report in partnership with the Legatum Institute to really look at this issue in depth since the revolution, since 2011. What have been the dynamics for the security services in Tunisia as they've faced multiple attacks over the years, and the response of the country in facing those, and particularly tapping into the really impressive knowledge of civil society in Tunisia. I mean, this is one of the real core values, one of the core strengths, I think, in Tunisia that we haven't seen in other places, to keep the transition on track, to make sure that as the political process moves forward, that they're living up to the values that they espouse. And so I think this is a very well researched and well done report, and I'll let him tell you a bit more about the findings. After Fado, we'll also be joined by several experts on the region and on this issue. Next, we'll hear from Corinne Hanlon, who's the president of the Strategic Capacity Group, who will offer some thoughts in response to the report and her own analysis on the situation in the country. And then Dan Brumberg, the co-director of Democracy and Governance Studies at Georgetown University. So with that, thank you, and I'll turn over to Fala to get us started.
Thank you very much, Cole. And let me first thank Pomed for hosting and organizing this, and especially Rabia and especially Alex. And let me also thank Legatum. This report is a lot stronger because of Anne and Chloe and Christian from the Legatum Institute who've really helped with their input and making this a much stronger report. I'm honored to be here with Karine and Dan. I haven't met them in person yet, but of course I've read their stuff, and I've learned a lot from both of them. And let me thank the audience as well, because I see we have some very sharp minds who follow Tunisia very closely, and I'll really be interested in hearing your feedback. So the question that this report was really trying to answer was, what has Tunisia's response to terrorism been? Terrorism, we're talking about, well, this year we had the 2 terrorist attacks that targeted tourist sites that ended up with 60 people dead. And we're talking about the 2 assassinations in 2013 that almost derailed Tunisia's political transition process. And we're talking about a low-level insurgency that really began in the spring of 2013, and perhaps some other plots that we don't know about that were stopped by Tunisia's security forces, and some other things that we wouldn't consider terrorism that have been talked about in the context of terrorism, including vandalism and street fights. That have happened throughout the transition process. And the answer to this question really was, it has been a politicized response. Politicized in the sense of the way that the security sector is approached, both by politicians, by people within the Ministry of Interior, which is really the key player here, have seen security not as public security, but in terms of how can it best serve their interests. And this politicized response really has been a threat to democracy, and in some ways to security as well. And it's shocking because it comes at a time when Tunisia is being talked about as a democracy, when it's being hailed for some of its progress, and at a time when the security sector is really fragile, when there's sort of fragmentation and not complete control by civilian chiefs. Just briefly on the Ministry of Interior and the role that it plays. I mean, we have to remember that the revolution was really against a police state, not just in terms of political police, not just in terms of surveillance, but also we're talking about an economy that's very dependent on the state and public sector, and so much of hiring had to at some point go through the Interior Ministry, or the Interior Ministry could intervene in ways that could stop hiring or use its power for patronage. If the revolution was in some ways against this police state, defined by the Ministry of Interior's centrality to the state, then there's been sort of a counter-revolutionary project that's been spearheaded by the Ministry of Interior, and they've sort of been rehabilitated through the fight against terrorism, and that's what we're talking about here. They've explicitly, security forces have explicitly used the media, whether it's through their unions or through top officials or some of their allies, using the media to sort of change the discourse from one of revolution to one of terrorism. Like one example that I have in the report is a police officer at a trial of a police officer shouting that there's no more martyrs at the revolution. The only martyrs in Tunisia are the security forces who are fighting terrorism. They've, at the same time, there's also been sort of lobbying on the part of security forces to sort of counteract some of the gains of the revolution. And that's happening at a time with fragmentation and sort of Ministry of Interior not being under civilian control, which was sort of extensively documented in this last crisis group report. One example of their lobbying has been sort of the anti-terrorism law, which has been condemned by human rights organizations for many reasons, but particularly the fact that pre-trial detention has gone from 6 days to 15 days, and the Tunisian justice system is really still sort of based on confession rather than evidence. We can get into that a little bit later when we're talking about security sector reform. In terms of how this project has sort of affected democracy, obviously, the terrorist attacks themselves have attacked the Tunisian state. But it's not just, I would say now there's a group of politicians who see all opponents of the state, not just violent opponents, as being terrorists. And in some cases, this is sort of broadening to all critics of the state. As being painted with a brush of terrorism. So when you're looking at political opposition, President Beji Qaid Essebsi, during his election campaign, he said that the supporters of his opponent were all Salafi jihadis. I mean, they were talking about 1.4 million Tunisians who voted for his opponent. With the anti-terrorism law, there were critics of the anti-terrorism law within Parliament. 10 of them abstained because of their critiques, and the government-funded newspaper La Presse attacked these 10 parliamentarians, saying that we should try them for terrorism because they're stopping the work of anti-terrorism. One person I talked to in the report, an MP from the Nahda party, said, well, as Islamists, we're seen with a lot of skepticism within the Parliament, and we have to be more royalist than the king to show that we are not associated with terrorism. So there's sort of a disciplinary factor in terms of within the Parliament, politicians not wanting to be on the wrong side of the terrorism debate. When you look at civil society, after the attacks, there's been shutdowns of associations that have gone back to old laws, not post-revolutionary laws, but old laws shutting down associations procedurally. And a lot of the information about these associations, about their links to terrorism, have come from the Ministry of Interior, which, if we consider the Ministry of Interior not completely under civilian control, there's a real worry among civil society activists I talk to about, well, what if tomorrow the Ministry of Interior comes and says, we have links to terrorism? Where is the proof? Where is the procedural checks to make sure that when a decision gets made to shut down civil society, that it's really going through the proper channels? And just one other thing is protests and labor unrest have also been sort of, when you're looking at the current government's discourse about this, have really been thrown into the same category. I mean, we had the Prime Minister giving an interview on the national television station, Wataniya, saying that in some cases labor strikes have been may have been incited by terrorists, or may have been used by terrorists. And we can also look at the emergency law as playing a part in this. The emergency law that was declared after the Sousse attack, talking about. I mean, this emergency law was made in the 70s, specifically in the context of a general strike. And I had MPs telling me that this doesn't help us at all fight terrorism. It's merely being used as to stop certain protests or labor unrest. And I think we've seen the Tunisian government backtrack on that finally by stopping the state of emergency. The second thing is in terms of the threat that the current climate may have to security itself. In this sense, counterterrorism, as it's been used, whether it's the discourse or whether it's even tactical operations in Tunisia, may be helping to create an environment that's conducive to creating terrorists. Let me qualify that, because I think, first of all, we're talking about counterterrorism that's run by a Ministry of Interior where we know there's a lot of corruption. And that we've seen, I spoke to a parliamentarian who went to the border and said that military came up to them and said, Tunisia is being sold by the police and customs officials, letting in arms. And this is also something that Transparency International found in its recent report on corruption within the defense sector in the Middle East. So we're saying employees of the Ministry of Interior allowing arms into the country. That in itself is a real threat for security, I believe. We can also talk about the fact that there are people within the Ministry of Interior who have had intelligence on specific terrorist attacks, but that intelligence has not made it up to civilian chiefs. That as well, I think, when we're looking at the Brahmi murder in 2013, there was we saw that the Interior Minister had said that we had received information from the CIA saying that this man was a target beforehand, but that information never got up to him. With the Bardo attack, one of the gunmen, Khashnawi, his father had been going to the police saying, I'm worried about my son. He's gone to Libya. We think he's been radicalized. And there's reporting saying that the police had told him, what does it matter to us? And I think in terms of operation, we've seen this number presented, an official number presented by the Ministry of Interior, saying that at the beginning of this year, the first 6 months, there was 100,000 arrests from January till July. Talking to lawyers, civil society activists, and politicians, this has largely been included people based on their looks, Salafis, people who have long beards, people who have jubbas, but who may not have, there may be no evidence that they are guilty of plotting any violent attacks. It's almost arbitrary arrest, but it's arbitrary in the sense that it's not linked to potential crimes, but the way that they look. And the fact that torture does still occur in Tunisia, when you're talking about these numbers of people being arrested, I think there's a real threat of radicalization. I mean, we can look at where some of the key terrorist leaders have been radicalized, whether it's within Tunisia itself, Ansar Sharia, Abu Ayyad al-Tunsi, the leader of that, spent time in Tunisian prisons. Or we can talk about, historically Al-Qaeda leaders spending time in Egyptian prisons, being tortured there. Or now with ISIS, Camp Buka, where ISIS or Al-Qaeda in Iraq and Baathists met and ended up planning what we've seen now in Iraq and Syria. And just to move on to what this means in terms of security sector reform. I didn't offer extremely specific reforms because I think the most important thing is sort of changing the way people think about this. I think security sector reform really needs to be on the agenda. And security sector reform defined not just in terms that the Ministry of Interior itself asks for, which is just training and equipment. I mean, I think there's a serious problem there because there's equipment that I've heard stories about equipment coming into Tunisia, the Tunisian ports, and not going anywhere because there's no allocation within the Interior Ministry. Or I've heard stories about how the richest police districts end up taking the nicest equipment. So when you have sort of a structural breakdown in the Interior Ministry and you have them not necessarily being under civilian control, and you have a problem of motivation as well because they see the revolution as being having been against them, I think it's a bigger problem than simply training and equipment and logistics. I think a lot of people are seeing the military as the solution because there's so many problems with the Ministry of Interior, with the police and the National Guard, that people are looking to the military now as a potential solution to Tunisia's security problems. But there's also risks there, and I think we should keep that in mind. There was an interesting article in Carnegie by Anwar Bukhar's warning about the politicization of the military. But also, if the Ministry of Interior can always play a spoiler role, in any sort of counterterrorism strategy, especially if they're the ones writing strategy. So I don't think that's necessarily a long-term solution, but I'll pass on to my fellow co-panelists because I'd like to hear some of their thoughts on this as well. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much for laying that out. I think that's an excellent overview of the report and definitely want to hear more of your recommendations, but I'm sure we'll get to that in the Q&A. So Corinne, you want to take over from there? Thank you.
Thank you very much for inviting me here today and for that excellent report. It's always serendipitous when you prepare remarks in advance on a panel and you don't know what your colleagues are going to say, and then you sit here and listen and realize that actually if we had designed this, my remarks follow very nicely on yours. Many of the comments that you make about security sector reform are in fact what I wanted to talk about today. So hopefully we can continue the conversation and I can get into some more detail about the SSR challenges, which I've been focusing on in Tunisia since shortly after the revolution. I've served on some official assessment teams, so I've had access into some of the security sector functions within the Ministry of Interior. Also, because of my time at NDU, National Defense University, I had a number of senior military students, former students of mine, that were in the Ministry of Defense, which gave me access to the Ministry of Defense and some of their SSR challenges as well. So I'm going to try in a very short period of time to cover SSR challenges in Tunisia, which is an enormous topic. And so as I go through some of the headlines, I'm happy to return to any of these issues in detail in the Q&A section, but I don't want to take up too much of our time here today. So I've been asked to talk about Tunisia's SSR challenges and what reforms are needed to transform Tunisia's security apparatus, and we use that term very explicitly, into an effective and accountable security system that operates in accordance with democratic principles and the rule of law. Quite simply, the central SSR challenge in Tunisia is that its security apparatus was created for the purpose of regime protection and not necessarily public order. And I don't feel that I need, with this crowd, to go into the details of how Ben Ali's system worked, except to say that that internal security apparatus remains largely intact today. And in some ways, when you talk about SSR in Tunisia, the story doesn't really change. And I think this is maybe where our reports differ. You're talking about a real transformation in terms of the CT challenges. But in terms of the basic SSR priorities and the SSR reform agenda, if we looked at the reform agenda from 2012 to today, it's largely the same because very little progress, sadly, has been made on security sector reform. And the lack of reform and the complete lack of public information about any plans for reform, or alternatively, a rationale for why reform is being delayed, is fueling growing disillusionment and anger. And there's now a sense that Tunisia's revolution is, in the words of a young smuggler in Kasserine who we met with, a revolution of no hope and no dignity. So in terms of SSR, the biggest priority has to be reform of the internal security sector. Military reform is a low priority. The military embrace civilian authority. They're not corrupt. They're not entrenched economically like the military is in Egypt, for example. But reliance on the military for internal security functions, as you mentioned, is a very worrisome development. And this has to be addressed by empowering and reforming the internal security forces and institutions to meet the needs and aspirations of Tunisia's population. So what specifically are some of these SSR challenges? The first is that the security apparatus is itself completely Byzantine in complexity. Their structure is heavily siloed. There's classic coup-proofing mechanisms. Tunisia's statutory forces, those that have the statutory authority to wield force, are under the oversight of the Ministry of Defense, the Ministry of Interior, the Ministry of Justice, and the Ministry of Finance. There are also presidential guard forces that report directly to the president. The military report to the MOD. In the MOI, you have a national police, which operates in urban areas, a national guard in rural areas, and a civil police. And on top of that, and within each of these, you also have a host of special forces. You have judicial police that work in the Ministry of Justice, but for human resources and promotion, we found that they're still tied to the Ministry of Interior. And the Gardes Forestières, which report to the Ministry of Finance, have both a border security function as well as an intelligence function. So the MOI itself is the proverbial black box of the Tunisian security sector. It's complexly organized, it's divided into directorates and subdirectorates. There's duplication, there's costly overlap and redundancies. Every directorate has its own common services, which takes care of pay, resources, and logistics. There's a similar duplication for equipment. There are multiple special services with subdirectorates in the police and National Guard that mirror each other. There's a directorate of intervention forces, which includes specialized tactical units that include crowd control, anti-terrorism units, explosives, VIP protection, K9, cavalry, and other specialized units, and these are mirrored exactly both under the National Guard and the National Police. There's a directorate of special services, which is the intelligence branch, which is more than what you normally find in police intelligence. They oversaw the political police that was disbanded in 2011, but they continue intelligence functions. They oversee airport security, they work on borders, and they oversee foreigners. And then you have a land and maritime borders directorate within the National Guard. So I should note as I go through all these different directorates and subdirectorates that this information is actually not publicly available in Tunisia. Most Tunisians have no real idea of what's within the Ministry of Interior, what all these directorates are called, who reports to them, who runs them, how many forces there are, how the special units report to each other, work with each other, who are they overseen by. There is the actual org chart of the Tunisian Ministry of Interior was classified as a state secret for many years. There is now an org chart that has very little detail in it on the website. But if you think about accessing the Pentagon and looking for a particular office here in the United States, you quickly find out who's there, what the positions are called, who sits in those positions. You can probably click their name and get their bio. None of this information is available in Tunisia. And so many international actors that are working there are always sharing, various org charts that they've tried to piece together through meetings and interactions within the Ministry of Interior. So this really complex, siloed structure is going to shapes the institutional culture of the internal security sector, as I'm sure you can imagine, and it has very interesting ways that it's managed. For example, all officers that deal with in the land forces, which is your military, your National Guard, your police, and your customs, go to the military academy for officer training. There's no police academy in Tunisia. So if you imagine they attend like our officer cadets do at West Point, they take classes together, do sports together, live in the barracks together. And upon graduation, they were prohibited from having any contact with each other, not just professionally, but also socially. So if you think about your alumni network and you find out somebody's gotten married or has a child, there is absolutely no contact allowed. This is, again, part of that whole coup-proofing approach. And when I interviewed the head of the Land Forces Academy in 2013, he said to me, it's just beginning to change where I can now talk to a former classmate, where before that was completely forbidden. In the aftermath of the revolution, there was a meeting that was held in the Ministry of Interior that some international actors were present at, and they were absolutely amazed to find that there were individuals that worked on opposite sides of the same hallway in the building that had actually never met each other before this particular meeting. A second key challenge is that there is limited to no coordination or collaboration among all of these different siloed institutions. And this is not just because of the Byzantine structure, but it's also because of a legacy of distrust that was generated by these very coup-proofing mechanisms. The national police were favored under Ben Ali. They have the most to lose with reform, and they're most resistant to reform. There were very serious tensions between the military and the police that were not helped by the process of the revolution itself and the fact that the military are considered to be heroes of the revolution. And you have very interesting implications for operations. For example, when the Secretary of State Hillary Clinton arrived in Tunisia, she landed at the airport. The airport's controlled by military forces. The personal protection forces were not allowed onto the airport grounds to meet her. They had to wait outside the gate until the military escorted them out. And this was not for operational reasons. This was just because the distrust is so deep that the police are not allowed onto the grounds controlled by the military or vice versa. Given our focus today on CT, this distrust is also very important when we look at coordination among all these various specialized forces. They don't work together. They don't train together. Even within the police themselves, there's limited coordination. And this creates really big problems in counterterrorism, and particularly on the borders, because the response on borders and for counterterrorism has to be an interagency one, because those missions overlap to a great extent. On the borders, we see some coordination, but it tends to be informal by exchanging personal cell phone numbers. If you actually want to coordinate formally, you have to go back up to Tunis and then back down to your counterpart, the same area on the border. So everything has to go to Tunis for decisions at the highest levels. And this is really frustrating to mid-level operational commanders and officials that are not empowered to make decisions, even though they recognize that change is needed. Third is this whole idea of the mission. Right now, the mission remains very much regime protection and not service to the population. The idea of the population as a customer of the police, right, is a completely alien concept. Police are trained to see the population as a threat, and this remains as a reflex that's ingrained by training and years of operations, especially for more senior officials and for commanders. There's a lot of discussion in Tunisia about reforming, changing into a democratic institution, but there's little evidence that there's an understanding of what that actually requires. For example, adding a few hours of human rights training to a police cadet's curriculum is not going to make that police officer, when he graduates, able to operate in accordance with human rights principles. And the way they teach this, by the way, is PowerPoint. I sat in on one of these classes. It was a PowerPoint presentation that basically reproduced the various important texts from international treaties and documents, probably tested by a multiple choice exam at the end. So nothing experiential, nothing to put a police officer into a situation where you're actually testing human rights principles without actually telling him that's what you're doing. Because human rights has to be in all aspects of police operations, not just a little 2-hour PowerPoint presentation. In meetings with senior officials right after the revolution, and I think up until today, there is this belief that the police aren't functioning well and they're ineffective because they don't have enough equipment and they have poor pay and poor working conditions. And if you talk to the unions, you will hear this same story. And they generally seem to believe if they could just get some more equipment and if they could improve the pay of the police would operate better and the population would trust them more. There's also a belief that better and more advanced equipment is going to make their CT efforts more effective. Again, it's the reliance on the equipment rather than about the actual policing mission and what it means to serve a population and to provide safety and security to that population. Fourth is this culture of secrecy and distrust. There is, as you mentioned, no information available. There's no transparency for public or other organs of government, even Parliament. Parliament has been trying to get the Minister of Interior to come and talk to the committees that focus on security and have been unsuccessful in doing that. And this distrust, and I think there's even fear within the Ministry of Interior, certainly in the early days, of citizens, of civil society, and of the press. And it's an amazing situation that if you're a Tunisian civil society organization and you want to request a meeting with an office within the Ministry of Interior, you actually have to go to the Office of International Coordination. So you're requesting a meeting alongside the ambassador to the United States and the ambassador to the UK, who come with a lot of funding and who are going to always be a higher priority. So there is really no way for an ordinary citizen or a civil society organization to request a meeting with the Ministry of Interior itself. This distrust has implications for operations and for the effectiveness of police in preventing crime, as you can well imagine. After the revolution, they disbanded the political police, which was their massive informant network where we got those very high numbers from when we first were learning about how many police there are in Tunisia. But when they disbanded it, there was no alternative created to actually collect the kind of information that police need in a democratic society to prevent crime. So police are effectively operating blind, and citizens are unwilling to provide information, which is the basis of a trust-based community policing model, because they don't trust the police. So they don't have the information, but they also don't have the mechanisms to try and build that trust that's necessary for the kind of partnership that citizens and police ought to have in a democratic society which follows a community policing ethos. Standard operating procedures and rules of engagements were designed for a totally different world where the police were feared. The police are no longer feared, they're reviled. So in some sense, they've lost that power to compel citizens, but they have nothing to replace it with. They don't know how to draw citizens in. They don't know how to build a relationship with citizens who see crime happening, could actually inform the police about it if they trusted that the police would do something about it and if they trusted that they weren't themselves being turned into informants. And this is a difficult transition that we see here in Tunisia, but in many authoritarian states where citizens have long served as informants, moving into a bridge where you actually build trust is a very difficult thing to do. So the police are themselves demoralized. And distrust and poor behavior on the part of police, as well as the ineffective provision of security, then feed well into the recruitment and radicalization narrative. I'll just jump here quickly to a final note, because I know that we're short on time, which is that since the revolution, and I think this dovetails nicely with the findings from your report, regular police are more and more being ignored in favor of specialized forces. The head of the Special Forces, the Brigade Anti-Terrorism, that I've met with on a few occasions, was describing to me the new operational environment that police are dealing with, which is a far more dangerous one than they were accustomed to prior to the revolution. And as he explained to me, before the revolution, ordinary Tunisian citizens didn't have weapons. And now he says everybody has a Kalashnikov. And so this more dangerous environment is driving an increased reliance on specialized units because they're seen as being better trained and better equipped. And they are better trained and they are better equipped. There's been a great deal of international assistance to strengthen these units. And the regular police have just not benefited from these kinds of efforts. In some sense, probably because the reform challenge is so enormous. And if you are a funder, an international donor, it's much simpler to provide equipment and training to a unit that's well organized and trained already than to have to face the enormous problem of reforming and transforming the police writ large. The problem is that when they ignore the regular police, this has serious long-term implications for security and public safety in Tunisia and for Tunisia's successful democratic transition, because these are militarized special units. They're not trained for community policing. They're not trained to engage with local communities. They don't go to local community meetings or meet with local governing councils. This is not what they've been trained for. They're dressed like black ninjas, one Tunisian citizen was telling me, and we're afraid of them, right? These are not police officers with which you engage in community fora. So focusing on the regular police can't just be about tactical police effectiveness, although that does need to be improved, or better equipment, and equipment gaps do exist. but it's really about generating a new ethos of service. Building trust between police and citizens requires empowering the police to actually engage with citizens and removing restrictions on police and local police chiefs from doing so, which do exist, by the way, to fulfilling their mission of public service, which has to be equitable, transparent, effective, and reliable provision of service for all citizens, no matter where they live or who they are.
Great. Thank you so much, Corinne. That was fascinating, especially the overview of all this just endless list of directorates and the different commands. I would love to see the org charts if you have them. I'm sure everyone else would as well. But now let's turn over to Dan Brumberg just for some final comments.
Thanks very much. Actually, I think I had met Fadil, but you were, if I may say so, about 11 years old when we met, which will put the time clock on me in a very scary way. And there are a lot of good friends sitting here at today's event, and I'm happy to see all of them here. And I want to say that my own introduction to this world of security sector reform is due in no small measure to my distinguished colleague to my left, with whom I started going to Tunisia in 2012.
Yeah, 12.
Yeah, early on, when there was still a sense of optimism. I'm going to try to put this report in some sort of wider political context. I think that's where I can contribute. I've just got back from a 9-day trip to Tunisia with my family, but that was all about actually being tourists as opposed to sitting in a room at another meeting. But I did feel that this was sort of the quiet before the storm, that things were deceptively serene, and that any moment something could just again exacerbate the situation, obviously with another terrorist attack. That things are much more fragile than we would imagine. And I want to, as I said, put these things in context. What did I draw out from this superb report, really? Many of the elements which I had been familiar with, including many of the sources, but this really brings together the whole picture, places it in context, and draws very dismaying conclusions. And I have to say, in the aftermath of Paris, I've thought even more about the I'm not chasing headlines here, but I do think the situation, the terrorist attack that was undertaken in Paris, really accentuates the challenge of meeting the problem of terrorism and sustaining democracy. And this is obviously not simply a challenge for Tunisia or for the region, but for all established as well as emerging democracies. And I was reminded, reading the many reports about Daesh, that they published a manual in which they said they're basically going after the gray zone. I'm not confusing this gray zone with Tom Carruthers' gray zone, by the way. That's a different gray zone. But this is a gray zone in which you have a large segment of the population which is on the fence and which could be drawn in either direction depending on the context. And I think the message of this report, I mean, it's kind of graphic because why is it always men dressed in black? On either side of the equation, the security side or the ISIL side or the Daesh side. It's kind of scary. Who precisely is this? I mean, this is very evocative and really speaks to the problem we're facing, and that is if the trends in this report continue, because there's a race between two dynamics that are unfolding simultaneously in Tunisia. One is a dynamic of securitization, which is completely dysfunctional, and greater authoritarianism, and one is a dynamic of democratization, and they're happening at the same time, but the securitization autocratization process is escalating more quickly than the democracy equation. And one of the things that comes across clearly in this report is that there is no contradiction between democracy and fighting terrorism. There's a necessary connection, that you can't have one without the other, that the failure to pursue democracy and to place the security apparatus and the Interior Ministry in the context of a democratization process and link the two. The failure to do that will undermine the Tunisian democracy and exacerbate the security situation beyond a point which they may not be able to turn it around. So we're coming up to a critical moment here. And again, the headline has to be that democracy and security should and can go hand in hand if it's done correctly. And the question is how to do this. And the question also is how not to do this. This is a report about how not to do this. I mean, this is clearly everything that has been done. And we encountered this from the very beginning when we knocked on the door of the Interior Ministry, and nobody seemed to be at home at the time. And that hasn't changed very much, although my colleague apparently has gotten some ins that have been very useful. But nothing has changed in a positive way. I mean, after all the meetings, and I want to say here that I also work at USAP, and nothing I'm saying reflects the position of USAP. But after all the meetings that we've had in context with USAP and all the conferences and all the engagements about reforming curricula, and to know and to learn that nothing has changed and it's only gotten worse is really dismaying, because the U.S. has been in different ways engaged on this issue. So you have these two sort of dynamics happening, and I will just unpack various elements of them very quickly. First of all, what the report reminds us is you have an expanding deep state, a coalition of forces with businessmen, former political bosses from the old regime, security sector actors, smugglers, and they are becoming a system. They are joined together. And if that continues uninterrupted, they'll become better at what they do, and it will be hard to dislodge this system. And so it's emerging every day in different ways. And it's connected, as the report says, and I think I'd almost like to see more about this, to the economy and the question of economic reform. So that's one thing that comes across very clearly. Another thing that comes across very clearly in this, and I've alluded to this already, and that is the failure to establish and advance democratic institutions and processes. And here, what the report shows us is that you have in Tunisia something that all scholars of authoritarianism know. We have the rule by law, not the rule of law. We have the systematic exploitation in a very arbitrary manner of laws in order to support the security apparatus and go after so-called terrorists. This is happening in the absence of progress to solve the critical question of creating a Supreme Court, which is all wrapped up in this Byzantine struggle over the magistrates, that if you can understand it, because when I go to Tunisia, the Tunisians can't understand it. So I feel comfortable not understanding it myself. But we can't get to a point, because if you can't establish an authoritative Supreme Court, because you have a backlog of laws that have to be dealt with, and nothing is happening. And then your report also reminded me that 85% of the legislators are connected to parties in the cabinet. There is no loyal opposition. There is no effective opposition. There is no actual debate in a serious manner. Instead, the 10 unfortunate members of the opposition who suggested questions about the terrorism law were accused of terrorism. So you have a process of, and this is kind of facilitated by the breakdown within Nida Tunis, the internal political struggles, the internal economic struggles. The democratization process is slowing down to a near halt. And if you can't put these structures in place, the other thing is going to race ahead. So that's really dismaying. And then we have all this happening, of course, in the context of what is emerging, what is unavoidable in many ways, and this is the global effort, such as it is, to deal with the challenge of Daesh and how to deal with it, a challenge that really puts us into some difficulties, because, of course, the global autocrats are in love with this struggle. They would love to make the argument, Russia and Iran would love to make the argument that we should all band together and create an alliance to deal with this, this challenge. But in the process, of course, they're selling a different model. They're selling a very different model. And it doesn't take much effort to sort of borrow from other autocrats in terms of new laws and designs for civil society laws and the rest of it to restrain civil society. So the whole context puts the U.S. in this difficult position, because I'd like to think that we're a global democracy, but increasingly we find ourselves willy-nilly in Egypt and elsewhere facilitating authoritarianism. And this is disconcerting, to say the least, because again, in the case of Tunisia, if we don't stand up to this, and if we don't provide the correct incentives to address this issue, the terrorists the actual terrorists, not the supposed terrorists, will win out. And so that's disconcerting, obviously. Now, what can we talk about in terms of solutions? I've always been much better in analysis than solutions. And that's perhaps not unusual in this case, because we face a paradox. The Tunisian revolution was made in part by that very bizarre phenomenon called the middle class, which is not a coherent institution in Tunisia, as in many countries, particularly developing countries, part of which really had opted out for the authoritarian regime previously, and then bandwagoned on the rebellion to support the democratization process. And now that middle class is pivoting again towards authoritarianism, and this means that we have the challenge of that particular class, and we have the challenge of the state. How do you reform the state when the state is the problem? And this is the apex of the contradiction we're facing, and when there is so much resistance within it. And I have no easy solutions. The scholars who work on this issue, in terms of its applications to the issue of economic reform, talk about the necessity of finding like-minded colleagues within these institutions, of identifying potential or actual reformists, of creating islands of reformism by certain kinds of limited institutional changes which create a kind of solidarity between a network of reformists who then try to work within a sea of no reform to sort of advance certain kinds of goals. It's a very long process. There may not be time to do this, but that is certainly something that has been talked about a great deal. I don't know whether in the case of Tunisia, given everything Karina said, this is possible. But you've got to be able to find some sort of allies within the institution. If you simply demonize the institution, you'll get more resistance. So I'm not sure how to do that, but that seems to be one challenge. There's also, USAB has security sector, a North African security sector network, and I've been engaged with and dealing with, as Kieran has now for 2 years, and they are going to publish a report that I've helped out with as a kind of advisor on a kind of regional view of security sector reform. And I think it's important, maybe more symbolically than practically now, but that's still consequential potentially, to try to sort of mobilize regional networks of reformists, to give them a voice, to make this an issue that doesn't reduce to the Tunisian challenge at all, but talks about a kind of regional challenge, because ultimately the failure of democracy in Tunisia will be the last straw for North Africa. The notion, what's at stake here is not the security of Tunisia alone, but the whole region. So there's this emerging network of reformists who are trying to create a voice on themselves, I think is important, because in pushing that voice out and giving it strength and clarity, they may provide greater leverage for whatever islands of reformism there exists within this very dysfunctional security sector network. That's about as best as I can offer you for my views on what is to be done. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Dan, and thank you all for your sort of opening remarks and presentations, and especially thank you for staying on time. It makes my job very easy. I want to, before we open up to the audience, just get us kicked off with a couple questions here. I think you all have sort of put a lot on the table, but a couple things that jumped out at me. I was just reading this morning, of course, the strategic dialogue between the United States and Tunisia was over the weekend, led by Secretary Kerry. And I was rereading some of his remarks, and one of the quotes that jumped out to me is this one: We're not asking Tunisia to do things they don't want to do. We want to do the things that Tunisia describes to us will help the most. Of course, in many ways, I think that's very admirable. Of course, we want host country buy-in on lots of our assistance and development programs, and of course support that. But I think on this topic, security sector reform in Tunisia, like most places, is something that a lot of these institutions don't want to do. And so how do we square that? I mean, how does the United States and how do other international actors push in the right ways to say, this is why this is so important, this is sort of how we sort of view things going forward, and sort of as Dan's saying, how do we build allies within to support these kind of things? So maybe, Fadel, I'll put that to you as the first question. The second, maybe to Karine and Dan, if you want to chime in as well, based on your fieldwork in Tunisia. You talked a lot about the difficulties of security sector reform, especially when so many of these various components are siloed. And I think that, of course, that's a huge problem that we've seen over the past few years. One of the very specific, tangible projects to kind of address that from the previous government, the caretaker Prime Minister Joma, as well as it was a big focus for the previous U.S. Ambassador Jake Wallace, was to set up a kind of fusion center for intelligence and to kind of tackle this problem of silos within the security sector. I was wondering if you had any comments or interaction with those in your research, and if that is beginning to address some of these systemic issues. So maybe Fadl, if you want to start us off.
Yeah, that quote jumped out at me as well. Yeah, I mean, you want to support Tunisia in the way that Tunisians want, but I think that also has to be conscious of the fact that there's really two competing models in Tunisia. It's sort of democracy versus the police state. And, police state in the sense of, the only thing that is keeping Tunisia safe is an authoritarian, interventionist state based on police violence and fear. I think a lot of people really believe that. That's stability. That's what's going to make Tunisia stable. I mean, I talked to someone in the report that, said that Tunisia is only safe. Tunisia is not like Libya or Egypt or Yemen or Syria because we have a strong police sector. But that's. I think when people ask why are there so many foreign fighters leaving from Tunisia, well, those other countries have have domestic fights, whereas Tunisia, because of the pressure, a lot of them go abroad either to Libya or Tunisia. But at some point that can break down. At some point that they're going to come back to Tunisia, or the fear may not work in the long run. So if you're looking at these two models sort of competing at the same time, and Dan mentioned it as well in a broader sense. I think there is an opportunity to sort of approach it with one model in mind rather than the other model. And the other thing I just want to pick up on what Dan said about pushback from the ministry. I think that's absolutely right. If you come with too confrontational an attitude, there will be pushback. I mean, there's the officials off the record have been saying, if we push them too hard, the Ministry of Interior, maybe they won't be fighting terrorism with as much motivation as we'd want them to. So there's a real fear that we can't reform it. The best we can do is try and co-opt it, and that's. Unfortunately, co-optation is not happening just political parties, but co-optation is also happening. Private actors, businessmen are really getting involved in the scene. And when we're talking about the economy, if we're hearing a lot about the threat of smugglers and mafia, if that's getting involved as well, I think that spells a lot of danger for Tunisia going forward. So I don't know how much of an answer that is to the question, but that's how I was thinking about it.
So I think I'll try and answer actually both questions because I see them as being very closely linked. And I think it's important to, first of all, make a distinction between security assistance and security sector reform. We often, in our own discourse as we talk, we say we should be putting in place a security sector reform agenda. And it's important to note that we can't put a security sector reform in place. Obviously, the Tunisian government has to actually embrace SSR, security sector reform. They have to implement it. They have to change their laws. They have to change their practices. There has to be the political will to do that. As an outside donor, as a country, as a civil society, international organizations that are promoting this, you can encourage it, you can promote it, you can provide assistance, perhaps even link aid or security assistance to certain goals or certain achievements in terms of reform. But real reform, real change in how the mission of the police is defined, how they operate, the legal structures are something that we as outsiders can't impose. We can encourage it and we can try and promote it. So in some places where we talk about security sector reform, really the only thing that we can do is provide assistance. And maybe there are good reasons why we want to provide particular funds or weapons or training for a specialized unit because for whatever reason we think maybe that creates an initial inroad or starts to build a relationship. And so I think for the key here with Tunisia and with Secretary Kerry's comment was to try and find ways that, areas where the Tunisian government has the political will and will commit to reform, and then hopefully starting to build that into other areas. Now, that was tried right after the revolution, where the only thing that the Ministry of Interior was willing to contemplate from an outside actor was a new communications policy. And they spent a lot of time training the Ministry of Interior how to communicate with the public. They put together a whole report on communications, and it didn't actually change anything. And they're still doing communications training for the Ministry of Interior officials in Tunisia. So these things, I think the second point to make about SSR is these are decade-long initiatives, and they really only work when you can change the institutional cultures of places. And to do that, you really do need the commitment and will on the part of counterparts. Now, Dan's comment about finding agents of change, which we all like to use this term, but individuals, and in Tunisia and in the Ministry of Interior, there are quite a few of them. They're not at the senior level. They're at that mid to senior operational level. They're the people that are a couple layers down in the various directorates. They are a little bit younger. They have been to lots of international trainings. They know what they have and what they should have, and they really want to change it. And you have working groups in the Ministry of Interior, one on border security and one on counterterrorism, that are staffed by large numbers of these individuals. And these groups have been working and are trying to figure out how to change the operational approach to both sets of challenges. Now, the Fusion Center was an effort on the part of the U.S. government and others to try and solve that coordination cooperation problem I mentioned, which is particularly acute on borders because border posture in Tunisia is it's a three-belt system. You have the National Guard on the front line, and then you have the police manning the border posts. You have customs sort of all around that area, and you have your military and reserve. But how do you manage a border incursion or a challenge on the border, let alone the problems in Kasserine, if your four different elements of your border security mandate don't actually talk to each other, don't train together, don't run wide exercises together? So they did create some areas where command was shared and where they were starting to try and change these sorts of things. So the Fusion Center came out of that entire effort to say, well, we've got some success in borders, we're starting to see some efforts in counterterrorism, let's try and tackle the most difficult problem which is intelligence. And one of the big issues that has sort of slowed down this whole process is that the Ministry of Interior couldn't figure out which individuals to nominate to serve for the Ministry of Interior in the Fusion Center. So it stopped on who do we name to work in the Fusion Center. So I think it tells you just the extent of which the problems that exist and how hard it is to overcome it if you can't even move beyond who within the various power struggles within the Ministry of Interior gets allotted how many seats to serve on this critical fusion center, which of course is control of information, which is an important source of power that the Ministry of Interior always owned. So it sounds like it's a silly thing, but it really goes to the very basis of power for the various security ministers, and that's why it's been such a difficult challenge to overcome.
I don't have much more to add to that. The story of the fusion effort is illustrative of the challenges, I suppose. I mean, where do we have leverage? Well, Tunisia is desperate for economic assistance and aid at a critical point where they're trying to come up with some sort of internal social compact. I noted the other day that the leaders of the National Dialogue, Hussein Abbasi, was here, and I had an interesting conversation with him. And now that the dialogue has gotten sort of the Academy Award and has moved on, and we've beyond giving them the credit they do, we have to remember that one of the things that made the National Dialogue successful was a well-timed intervention by Western and regional forces that basically said to the players, you do this. You do this now, or else the following will. Now, I'm not sure we want to play that kind of card at this point, but Tunisia needs the support of the United States and the Western community. Of course, we're profoundly distracted now in the EU about the regional challenges of terrorism, but it's possible, I suppose, to make it clear in so many ways that certain things have to be done in the security apparatus arena if the U.S. is going to take the lead in pushing for economic aid. And I know that's difficult. I know issues of conditionality are very controversial and contentious, but I'm just trying to imagine with you as everybody sits here and tries to crack this nut about what we can do to really get the message across, because, I mean, we face a tautology. I mean, we need political will, but that just restates the problem. It doesn't solve it, does it? And so political will comes from an incentive or from pressure to have the political will. It's not something that's intrinsic. So I think we have to create conditions where, and if we have a strategic dialogue, I would hope that this message was made very clear, if not publicly, then in the quieter meetings that occurred.
All right, thank you. All right, I think we can open it up to questions now. We have mics, correct? Yeah. So if you can, wait for the mic to come around. Identify yourself and your affiliation if you have one. And as always, please make your question a question. Thank you. So let's see. This gentleman right here. Okay, just project for us. And maybe I'll just summarize and repeat after you.
All right, my name is Rick O'Sullivan, Change Management Solutions in the co-chair of Civil Society Work Group in Washington. favorite Twain quotes is the human animal is unique for its ability to learn from mistakes of others and noteworthy for its refusal to do so. A lot of the issues that you presented here are not unique.
They aren't unique to Tunisia. As far as the laws that you talked about, we need look no further than the Alien and Sedition Acts here in the United States in the 1790s, in which we were arresting Democratic and Republican newspaper editors, et cetera, by a federalist government. And your comment about the middle class, Thomas Hardy, Anatomy of a Revolution, cited that revolutions take place when the middle class can no longer accept the potential of being rich and embrace the reality of being poor. So what I'd like, you've each raised several questions, I would like each of you to pick one and give an example of that could be followed. In this country, they faced this is how they addressed it as a solution. I mean, the problems are well documented, but what do we do with them?
Dan, you want to start us off and we'll work down this way?
I start off with a question that I'm not really prepared to answer. My favorite Mark Twain quote is, "An expert is somebody from out of town." By the way, that's my favorite. So, and so that puts me well in that category. Okay, that's all right. That's out of town. I think I don't know the empirical answer to your question, but it's interesting you should ask me this, because the other day I had a conversation with a colleague at USAP, and we were saying, what can we gain from a comparative study of countries that face the same kinds of dilemmas and face the question of terrorism and had to engage local populations and did it successfully, not at the cost of democratization? Now, often the problem is that countries are unique and lessons that can't be transferred, and that's the challenge we always face. But if they're transferable lessons, what the countries are, I'd like to hear more from colleagues who have a wider angle view of this, because there may be ways of at least getting the knowledge base to think about what has to be done from successful cases, and perhaps if they're there, because we can say to our Tunisian friends keep saying, don't hold us up as a model, and we could say, we're going to hold you up as a model of failure as well. That's the potential down there. So what about models of success have addressed this particular challenge? And I think that is one way to handle it. The particular cases, I don't have enough of a knowledge base to say what they are, but they exist, I know that for sure, and we perhaps can begin to sort of try to learn some lessons from those.
This is always the great question in SSR, when you present the SSR framework, and the next question is, well, tell us where it's worked. And I can go back and say, well, SSR is a very new concept. It really emerged in the late 1990s. We really don't have enough time to identify good cases of success. But the problem is, any case of success that you bring up, you always have to do it with some caveats. The cases that are normally listed as being cases of successful SSR are those in Eastern Europe. And that's not a fair comparison, because the governments in Eastern Europe had a very strong political will to make changes, because what was at stake was membership in NATO and membership in the EU. And so that was a very strong motivating and driving force for these countries, and it's just not a fair comparison for any other places. What I can tell you is which cases the Tunisians are looking at, which is interesting. They look at Taiwan and Chile, both authoritarian police transitions. So where are you're looking for states that have undergone an authoritarian transition, where the big SSR challenge has been the authoritarian police practices. They've looked at South Africa a lot because it's an African case. And again, not all of the parallels are there, but it's one that they often return to. And off the top of my head, those are the three that when you speak with Tunisians who've been focusing on SSR, those are the cases they look at the most.
Yeah, as someone who doesn't focus so much on SSR, but on Tunisian politics, I think one of the recommendations I put forward is that I think that the security assistance should be conditional on reform, and obviously we have to have a broader sense of what sort of security sector reform is, other than just training and equipment. But if the main problem is that security and the security sector in Tunisia is defined in a way that's defending the regime or defending a party or increasingly defending private interests, rather than a public security sector, then I think one way to start is to really take steps towards public information and public information about the sector. Publishing budgets about the Ministry of Interior, or having a public dialogue about what counterterrorism strategy is, bringing in civil society, and not having it be decided within the Interior Ministry. Every time I was in Tunisia doing the research, asking people from the presidency or the prime ministry to talk to me about strategy, they'd send me to the Ministry of Interior. That's not how it should be. Even the Ministry of Defense, they said, go talk to someone else. So I think if you have sort of a public discussion and not just one conference about strategy, I think that can sort of help change the role that the Ministry of Interior plays in the Tunisian state.
One quick thought, kind of bandwagon on this for a moment, and the report addresses very clearly and usefully the role of civil society. I am somebody who believes that often we overdo the civil society component, that the problem is located in the state, and the capacity for the civil society sectors to play a role in part depends on the nature of the state, so we get involved in this conundrum, which we see all over the place. But given the extent to which the direction of the state, as it were, in Tunisia, and the important role that several Tunisian civil society groups, including iWatch Tunisia, really very important, one of the early ones on the ground, whose president I know quite well, they have an important role to play in terms of keeping these issues in the public space, keeping the debate, and getting this message across. If we have the bumper sticker, security and the struggle against terrorism depends on democracy. That's sort of that's too long for a bumper sticker. You got to have a big car for that. But, if we can get that message across and they can get it, and the problem here is the media. You said it in the report. I mean, the media and the bastions that are controlling the media and the lack of professionalization within the media, its instrumentalization by different groups, it really makes it very hard. But there's an opening to push to reopen that sort of space and to make sure that as much as possible in the public, Tunisia is in many respects has a very educated public. We know this. As much as the debate has been warped in the last few months, and as much as people are fearful, it's not easy, but I think those organizations could still play an important role. And if the continuing effort to shut down civil society moves apace, then we won't have that opportunity. So that's another issue I would hope would be raised in the dialogue in Tunis, because without those groups pressing, we're not going to have any pressure for change internally anymore.
All right, we've got about another 15 minutes, so maybe we'll take several at a time here. Let's go to this side right here.
And so I was just wondering what the dynamics were with the clans, as you put it in the MOI, and also as far as the new deep state, is it more of like a rebirth of the old Ben Ali deep state, or is it a new thing, or is it some combination? Thank you.
Okay, let's take another one. Other questions? I saw Michelle. Yes.
Michelle Dunn from the Carnegie Endowment. Dan, could you talk a little bit more about what's going on inside Nida, Tunis, and how that relates to what you were talking about sort of the expansion, of the deep state and the relation to economic interests and so forth?
Okay, and one more right here in the front. Thank you.
My name is Misha Benoit-Lavelle. Working, is it? I'm an MA student at George Washington University, and I was a journalist in Tunisia with Fadl for a few years. My question to Fadl, but I'd be interested to hear anyone else's answer as well, is given the fact that it appears the upper-level administration of the Ministry of the Interior is going to be extremely resistant to change, really, no matter what the political party in power. I mean, if Ennahda is not going to be in a position to, push back on them when they have all the reason in the world to do so, are there other actors within the Ministry of the Interior who might be more amenable to pushing for reform from within with the police unions? You mentioned them, that they sometimes have not the most sophisticated view of the situation, but they also have some claims which could be legitimate. Their pay is legitimately very, very low, and there obviously are, for anyone who's reported and worked in Tunisia knows there are individual police officers who are, perfectly nice and professional people who could, conceivably be interested in reform. So I was wondering if you guys think that if that's feasible at all, and if not the police union, if there's anyone else who could be reform-minded. Thanks.
All right, thank you. Fado, if you want to get us started, maybe with that last question about sort of how to push reform when MOI resistant on the top, who would be amenable, and maybe also this first kind of related question on the clans and the MOI and the deep state as a new or a rebirth issue.
Something that I stuck out to me during my research was someone was explaining that within the Ministry of Interior, everyone's got their own little archive of information, and it moves with them. So people here talk about stovepiping or silos of information, but really that's a function of power. I mean, you want to keep that information because it's leverage, and that's sort of trying to capture that is what has sort of been part of the story in terms of the fragmentation of the Ministry of Interior, but. When you talk about the security unions, I mean, they see themselves really as, or at least the line they keep saying is, we're a Republican police force. Well, Republican is really like above the politicians. In the context of Ennahda, it was so much of, well, for years, we security forces were fighting these Islamists, and suddenly they're in charge. There was real resistance to that, and they found other paths of dependence so that they, as an institution, it wouldn't be completely co-opted or reformed by the Islamists. But I think that understanding as well has got to change in terms of we're above the politicians. But how we get there, I think that's something we're all trying to figure out as well.
Do you want to jump in on that, Karine, and then Dan maybe finish up with Michelle's question on the dynamics in Nidda?
I thought I would address the willingness of police to reform and that question that was raised. And I was remembering I had an interview with a very senior police officer. If you can imagine an American sitcom, he's that sort of very grizzled senior police chief who's had years and years of experience on the ground. And he was sort of the Tunisian equivalent of that, a perfect stereotype. And we just got to the question of torture. And I was thinking about this as we were talking about Tunisia being a confession-based system. And he said to me at this interview, he said, look, with all my years of experience, when I have someone sitting across from me, and I just know from my experience he's guilty. I just know. I mean, I've seen this plenty of times. I can read these guys. This guy's guilty. He said, how am I going to have the evidence to convict him without the threat, right? The threat, the use of torture to force this individual to confess. And he was saying this and the tone of the conversation was interesting because he was genuinely asking, like, how do we do this? What tools as a police officer do I have with all my years of experience? I know this individual across from me is guilty. I work in a confession-based system, so I need the confession to be able to prove. How do I have that individual confess? How does that work? And there's so many different kinds of conversations that I had with police through the police unions and others where when you talk to individual police officers, including this one, there was a police chief I met who said, after the revolution, now I finally am able to do my job. I actually have some authority to engage with the population. I've started citizen groups. I actually had an event where I brought children in to meet police officers, right? This is something that we see here as being quite common, but was a completely new kind of approach. So there are individuals within the police and within the security forces, and the National Guard as well, that get that the system doesn't work. I mean, they live in these communities. They know that they're the most reviled organization of the old Ben Ali regime. They do want to find ways to change it. The mid-level political officials in the Ministry of Interior are also tremendously frustrated that they realize that change needs to happen and they don't have the power to make those changes. So I think if we were to put a little bit of hope into our discussion, I think that there is interest and there are people that are willing to, that want to learn, that want to find a way to do this, that want to find a way to solve these problems. And that is an important part of identifying those and finding ways to empower them. whether that's through civil society, keeping those conversations front and center, whether it's through initiatives by international donors that identify and bring these individuals together so that they're not isolated in their ministries, but that they have colleagues who have similar interests and similar approaches, and whether you try then to gradually build a larger and larger group within those places where you have entry points to start to promote new thinking and new approaches. But it's a very slow process. And so I thought I'd just answer with that.
Okay, and just this is a very illustrative example that Kieran's just mentioned, because if you consider, when we were in Tunis the first or second time, we met with a group of lawyers who were pushing for a new law that would require the presence of a lawyer at an interrogation, which you would expect it would be a basic component of this process. And the perspective of our interlocutors was that's fine, but if the prosecutor doesn't have the information and the forensics to make a case, what else does he have other than to rely on torture? So one piece is always related to another, and the whole package goes to some extent together. It's systemic. And if you don't fix one, you really can't fix the other. So the incentive there is meaningless to have, these guys feel they have to produce results. And the system doesn't make it possible to do it not in one way. Well, it makes it possible to do it in one way, not another. So this is a huge challenge, and it emphasizes how much the pieces must, to some extent, go together, and that makes the challenge even greater. There are people in this room who are much better positioned to talk about the internal struggles in Nida, Tunis, or whatever we're going to call it, Nidal, Tunis, or Fauda, Tunis, or something like this. I'm not sure, but it's that's an inside joke. When I was in Tunisia not long ago, I heard a lot of whispering about this issue. And then a week later, it explodes in the public. And I'll just answer your question in this sense. When Ghannouchi was here, I interviewed him. I'm not going to tell you anything that I won't write publicly about our interview. And he said to me, when I met Essebsi in Paris on August 5 or whatever it was, that was a crucial moment, he said, because we decided basically to kick out the left. But they really didn't kick out the left, because the tensions within the party, and they're partly personal, they're very personal, but they're partly over economic issues. And Marzouk versus the son of Essebsi, very different perspectives on what is to be done about the economy, what they're willing to do, which interests are going to be affected. And I think this is part of what's going on. But I really don't understand enough of it to really answer in an authoritative way. It couldn't come at a worse time, this sort of struggle. I don't think, by the way, necessarily going to lead to the fragmenting of this party, because they know what the consequences are for who's in charge in the parliament and in the cabinet as a result. But it really makes it very difficult to have the kind of leadership and political will we're talking about. This issue of security sector reform doesn't even loom in this discussion that we're talking about on the economic issues, and that's disconcerting.
Additional questions? I saw some hands right there in the back. Yes.
Hi, Alyssa Miller from the Atlantic Council. Dr. Hanlon, you talked about the sort of lack of incentives in terms of membership in NATO and EU that was offered to Eastern Europe states in terms of SSR. There have been some nascent talks about FTA with the US, DCFTA negotiations with the EU have started, but it's unclear where they'll head. If those aren't strong enough incentives or things that the US and the EU can leverage, are there other institutions or other points of leverage that can be used beyond just monetary aid that haven't been explored?
Leo Siebert with IRI. Just to follow up on the last question, given what we know about the relationship between security apparatus and the democratically elected state, does economic incentive create security sector reform? If the president was to come to the Ministry of Interior and ask, we've got a lot of money on the table, we need to do this, is that something that the security sector would act upon? Could it?
All right. Thank you. Corinne, you want to get us started? Two
really tough questions. The EU-NATO question is a complicated one because when a country joins NATO, there are interoperability requirements, command requirements. There is a defense budgeting requirements. It's a very detailed list of requirements that a state has to accede to join. So almost by definition, the agenda of items that a state has to undertake to become part of NATO almost dictate a roadmap for SSR of the Ministry of Defense, certainly, and then also of the parliament and budgetary process. There's transparency requirements. And I can't think off the top of my head and at this moment of another institutional relationship that could propel Tunisia to make similar kinds of changes in the way that that particular relationship would in Eastern Europe. So unfortunately, no, I can't think of anything that would be like that. Certainly in discussions we've had with Tunisians, the economic issues and economic aid are an enormous request item, and perhaps that is something that could come with conditionality. But again, ensuring that that funding then actually makes real change rather than superficial change within the Ministry of Interior or the internal security sector is hard to be able to see and document, particularly if you don't have a good understanding of how it's working before the aid comes in. So it's a very complicated issue to conditionality piece of it, although certainly has been considered. In terms of the funding or financial incentives for the Ministry of Interior, I mean, tourism is such an important part of Tunisia's economy, and keeping tourists safe is a clear priority. Certainly within the lower levels of the Tunisian Ministry of Interior and with the police and the National Guard, absolutely. They're very unhappy with the fact that they are so hated by the population. I mean, before the revolution, when you were a young Tunisian and you applied for civil service exams, your last choice was to be a police officer. Just so different from in this country, for example, where you have families that say, my uncle, my grandfather, my brother, everybody was a police officer, I'm a police officer, they're proud of it. That doesn't exist in Tunisia. But it's the last resort government job, which is better than no job, right? So yes, up the ranks, I think there's an interest in change. But again, this is something that Dan always talks about. It's the pact of winners and losers. Is if you go through reform, and in the Ministry of Interior, reform is going to require change to the national police. And the national police have always been sort of the elite. They were always the favored entity. To make reform is going to change that position that they have. And so what is the incentive structure and how is that managed? And how is a roadmap or a political agreement negotiated in which there are incentives for winners and losers to participate in the process? I mean, ultimately, when you come down to it, that's how these agreements can happen. And so I don't know if economics alone are enough of an incentive in a question in where you're asking certain entities to actually give up power.
Yeah, I might add the winner and loser ledger is not encouraging. I mean, the CGTT, the labor union, the other day was trying to meet with Utica, the representative of business, and these were the two of the groups that led the national dialogue, and they couldn't meet, and because they can't agree. They have fundamentally different constituencies on economic issues, very different perspectives on reform. The CGTT, when you talk to the leaders from the labor union, you hear a discourse that seems 20 or 30 years old, frequently, not always, but frequently, and as if time has stood still. And so there's tremendous resistance. So there's no impetus there to sort of focus on these other issues. They're defending their turf and their interests as they see fit, and that makes it very difficult to put them in the ledger there of groups that would be supporting security sector reform. The tourism industry is manifestly hurting. I mean, it's a disaster. When I was in Djerba, the hotels were closed everywhere. I stayed in a lovely hotel. I think we were one of two couples or families in a hotel with 15 rooms or something, and everything else was deserted. You'd think that would speak volumes to the need. But people say, well, we put more soldiers. Yeah, on the beach, there were guys with rifles. But you didn't have a sense that this was really going to serve as a deterrent if somebody wanted to attack those beaches. Because that's not the issue is not simply deterrence. The issue is investigation, prevention. And look how difficult the French have had preventing the attacks It was a major breakdown. So the Tunisian security apparatus is very, very far from being able to meet that challenge.
Yeah, and just in terms of security, I mean, conditionality on security or economic assistance, you know, lending, there's always conditionality. I mean, the IMF always, you know, has conditions, some of which are very politically difficult, but they often happen. I mean, I don't see why theoretically you couldn't tie this to security sector as well. And you know, I think if you know, that question of, you know, if the government comes to you know, ministry officials and says, you know, we're not going to get this aid if you don't you know, do these conditions. Well, you know, if they're not too hard, I mean, if they're not directly threatening to the ministry, I don't see why that's not possible. I mean, you know, saying we're not going to get this unless you publish a budget, or unless you know, give us more details on your organizational chart. I think that's, you know, I'd be interested to see what happens if that's tried.
All right, thank you. And I think we just about run out of time today. I think this is a fascinating overview and you know, as I mentioned, a really good in-depth look at these challenges of security sector reform, what the challenges are, what the tools we have to try and address them, both from within Tunisia as well as from outside by the international community. So thank you all so much for coming. I also neglected to thank our friends at Open Society here for providing this space, which we're very grateful for. But also for all of our esteemed panelists, Dan, Karine, and congratulations to Fadel on your report and for laying this out. Thank you very much, and we look forward to seeing you again.